Welcome to Strip Cover Lit, where we squeeze the bigger picture out of literature. I am Adrian Ford, and we are here for the fourth in a six-part series as we float alongside The Wild Duck, act by act, and finally with a review over the text. The Wild Duck, of course, by Henrik Ibsen. So what we've got here is a breakdown of what happened in the act, followed by discussion of what happened herein. Gina is running the photography business when Hedvig busts in and she's wondering where Hjalmar could be, but Gina, she hasn't really noticed that it's been all that long that Hjalmar's been gone. But after a moment, he does return, and boy, is he in a mood, quite the tissy. Such a mood that he would like to wring that damn bird's neck, and we get this exchange. Hedvig says, "Oh no, father, you know that's my wild duck." And Hjalmar returns, "That is why I want to do it. Dum dum dum. I haven't the heart to, for your sake, Hedvig. But in my inmost soul, I feel that I ought to do it. I ought not to tolerate under my roof a creature that has been through those hands." A bit standoffish indeed, but Hedvig is then sent out, and Hjalmar demands of Gina that the paper part of the photography business be his. Gina concedes, but she wants to know why. She wants to know why that is to be his part of the business. I lost myself. Where'd I go? Gina concedes, but she wants to know why. Hjalmar wants to know what old Verley is paying old Ekdal. She tells him, and then he wants to know why it's that much. And why didn't he know? She sort of skips around, and she says that you didn't know that Verley was paying old Ekdal all that much because you wanted to believe it was for your pride, right? You wanted to believe that old Ekdal was depending on you, and so we let it be. We let it be for your pride. And what about Gina's business with Verley? What's going on there? Hjalmar wants to know. She gives him a bit of a runaround before admitting that yes, it's true. She had known Verley. She had business with Verley. And Hjalmar wants to know why she didn't tell him. Why didn't you tell me this? Our entire relationship built upon the sin of omission, as it were. And she says, well, if I had told you, would you still have married me? And he says, no, of course not. How could you believe that I would? How could you believe that I would have married you had I known that about you fooling around with Verley? And she says, well, that's why I didn't tell you. You can always count on someone for that type of honesty, right? A fight ensues until Gregers wants to come in. Isn't it great? He says, isn't it great? This fight that you're having. I spilled all the beans I knew. And now you're having this fight. Isn't it wonderful? What a son of a bitch. Well, it's great enough that they continue fighting long enough for Relling to show up. And Relling still doesn't like Gregers. He just doesn't like him. Thinks he's a bastard. But he wishes for the fight itself to die down, despite the fact that this knockdown drawout might, in fact, mean the end of Hjalmar and Gregers' friendship. But he wants that fight to die down for old Hedvig's sake. Hedvig is coming back around. And on account of her being there, shouldn't we just calm things down a bit? They calm things down just a tad. Long enough for Mrs. Sorby to show up. And Mrs. Sorby shows up to say that Verley has left for Hoydal. And she's shown up to tell Gregers that Mr. Verley said goodbye. And she herself has shown up to say goodbye to Gina. because she is going to follow after Mr. Verley, because the two will be married. Very quietly, very hush-hush, don't you know? They're going to be married, and she mentions in passing that Verley is going blind. And Hjalmar hits the roof. He doesn't understand what's going on. He didn't know that Mr. Verley was going blind. He didn't know any of this. He's taken aback, and then he refers to Gina's future husband. He says something about your future husband. And Mrs. Sorby, seeing what she's stepped in, decides to leave, decides she wants to go. And things are tense until Hedvig does, in fact, return. And when she returns, she has a gift from Mrs. Sorby. So Hjalmar demands to know what it is, and it turns out it is a letter. It is a letter written in Verley's hand. And Hjalmar, at this point, is damn sure he's going to read it. So he opens the letter, and it turns out that it is, in fact, a gift for Hedvig, whose birthday is the next day, but not really. It's a gift for old Ekdal from Mr. Verley. It turns out that old Ekdal will be receiving from Mr. Verley 100 crowns a week until he dies. He's going to be giving old Ekdal 100 crown a week until old Ekdal dies, at which time that 100 crown a week will become Hedvig's. It will then be Hedvig's 100 crown a week. And then on 68, we get this exchange. Hjalmar goes over to Gina, who stands by the stove, and says in a low voice, "Now please make a clean breast of it. If the connection between you and him was quite over when you came to care for me, as you call it, why did he place us in a position to marry?" And Gina says, I suppose he thought as he could come and go in our house. And Hjalmar says, only that? Was he not afraid of a possible contingency? And Gina says, I don't know what you mean. To which Hjalmar says, I want to know whether your child has the right to live under my roof. Gina draws herself up. Her eyes flash. You ask that? Hjalmar says, You shall answer me this one question. Does Hedvig belong to me? Or, well, Gina looking at him in defiance. I don't know. Hjalmar quivering a little. You don't know? Gina, how could I know? A creature like me. Hjalmar quietly turning from her. Then I have nothing more to do in this house. Gregers, take care, Hjalmar. Take care. You just learned your whole life might be a lie. Take care. Think what you are doing, he tells Hjalmar. Hjalmar puts on his coat. In this case, there is nothing for a man like me to think twice about. And Gregor says, yes, indeed, there are endless things to be considered. You three must be together if you are to attain a true frame of mind for self-sacrifice and forgiveness. Hjalmar says, I don't want to attain it. Never, never. My hat. He takes his hat. My home has fallen in ruins about me. He bursts into tears. Gregers, I have no child. Hedvig, who has opened the kitchen door, says, What is it that you are saying? Coming to him, Father, Father. That is rough. Gina, a little bit later, leaves to retrieve Hjalmar. And while she's gone, Hedvig reveals how much that wild duck means to her. It turns out that Hedvig prays every night for two things. Her dear old pops and that damn duck. So, doing what any rational adult would do, Gregers talks Hedvig into letting her father shoot it to death. That seems like the right thing to do, and wouldn't you know it, Hedvig agrees. The budding little nihilist that she is. So, what is there to talk about in this act of the play? I want to start on page 59. There is... Where are we at here? Okay. Gregor says, "You will not understand me, Mrs. Ekdahl. Well, I suppose need time to... But you, Hjalmar, surely you have a new consecration after this great crisis." This is the crux of things to Gregor's. Gregor's thinks that by going through crisis, everything gets better. It is faith well tested that is faith well deserved. This always reminds me, this line of thought always reminds me, when I was 21, I think, I got a job. I followed a former manager to a different company, and he was sort of a weird fella. Sort of strange, maybe not quite as weird as me, but weird enough to want me to follow him. And he was super religious, and he was one of these guys. There's a place around here called IHOP, but it's not the International House of Pancakes. It's the International House of Prayer. And he would frequent that place. And I say it's sort of a strange place, even among religious folk. It is one of these places where I don't know how prevalent it was, and I certainly don't know how prevalent it is, but there was a sect of Christians at the time that were called laughing Christians. And they would work themselves up into hysterics and read the Bible out loud while laughing the whole time. A bit eccentric, right? I mean, that's out there. But he, who was so deep into this type of religion, even, I mean, he would do the laughing Christian thing, or I can't remember exactly what it was called, something like that. He would do all that, and he had been a Christian his whole life. But he would always tell me he would never be as close to God as was his wife, because his wife didn't grow up Christian. And I didn't really understand that, but he said that it was of his opinion that because he had grown up Christian his whole life, he was never afforded the distance to really question things and end up coming back to God or finding God. In the household where he lived, where he grew up, he had always had God. So by his reasoning, and apparently the reasoning of a whole lot of the people in his sect, converts to Christianity have a great advantage spiritually over people who are born Christian. And I think that is a little bit of the same mindset that we're getting out of Gregor's here. Gregor's is saying, you have to decide against something. Here in this place, we would have Hjalmar deciding against raising his daughter and keeping the marriage to his wife. And once you decide against it, if it's really meant to be, you'll come back. Which is a shitty little game to play with things in your life. But it's kind of nihilistic, isn't it? One of the seminal phrases of nihilism comes from Pisarev. The ultimatum of our camp is to basically what he says is you want to try to destroy everything in your life. And if it ends up not going away, then it's pretty good and you can keep it. That's actually one of the original tenets of nihilism. So this thought by Gregor's on, well, I'm just going to ruin their relationship. And if it's not meant to be, then no one's lost anything, right? So he introduces all of this information that, look, let's be honest. It's not extracurricular information. This is stuff that if a relationship is built, so if we're assuming, now I have suspicions that in the final act, Yalmor's eyesight's going to be going, and it's going to be Gina was talking facetiously here. But assuming that's not the case, this is information that one would really wish to have known at the beginning, at the onset of a relationship, right? If the woman you're going to marry is already pregnant, it's kind of a big deal. That is, I mean, would you say that is a worse lie than cheating on someone? Even though it's, you had these sexual acts before your relationship. That's fine. But you've been lying to me the whole time about this kid being mine. That is pretty extreme. What's the old Kanye West song? Gold Digger? I'm not saying she's a gold digger. And he's got the line, 18 years, 18 years, and at the end of 18 years, he found out that kid wasn't his, insinuating that he'd paid for everything, for the kid's whole life, and found that it wasn't his child. But those are pretty big bombs to be dropping, especially to be doing it with such a cutesy little sort of idea in mind as Gregors is communicating. But a little, where are we at here? Where am I at? Okay, so a little bit before that, we have this from Gregors. After so great a crisis that is to be the starting point of an entirely new life, of a communion founded on truth and free from all taint of deception. What he's comparing this to is suicide. So essentially, what Gregor's entire philosophy herein seems to be is that we have to endure little deaths. Contemplation of suicide, pure, genuine, thorough contemplation of suicide is in itself a type of death. It is the reconsideration of every relationship, of every moral standpoint that one has in their life. And after that moment, one is indelibly different. What he's done is he's taken that moment of the contemplation of suicide, and he sort of generalized it into other smaller moments. Arnold Schwarzenegger in, Pumping Iron, said that his entire life is great because when he's not working out, he's with women. And when he's with women, he gets to come. And when he's in the gym, basically, it feels the same, and he gets to come. And when he's on stage at these competitions, he's beating other people and winning, well, he gets to come. And he generalized an orgasm into every moment of life. That is good. But good isn't change. Fun does not equal productive. Arnie's philosophy was towards fun, in the same way that Gregor's philosophy is towards productive. Arnie's orgasm, coming, is Gregor's truth. That is the pinpoint moment of cognitive or social insurrection by which everything is changed. And it is an interesting outlook on life, but it's not exactly all that conducive to a social life. In a family, being at least some great percentage a social life. It's not all about the productivity part, right? Gregor's, being a loner, doesn't really understand this. A little bit earlier than either of those quotes, Gina, on that same page, says, God forgive you, Mr. Verley. And I think, this is the first time in this play that Gregor's is referred to as Mr. Verley. I might be mistaken, there might be something I have overlooked, but if that is in fact the case, we've already done a great deal of talking about what it is that makes someone the Mr. last name. In many circles, Hjalmar is known as Mr. Ekdal, not Old Ekdal. Old Ekdal is Old Ekdal. You have to be the forefront man in your family to be Mr. last name. Here, Gregor's assuming Mr. Verley is assuming Mr. Verley not because of any great act, not because he's the head of a family, not because he started a business, become successful or profitable. Gregor's becomes Mr. Verley because he's done a great deal of damage. He's come in and single-handedly wrecked an entire household. And because of that, you know what? You are the real Verley. An interesting take on things. On 61, this comes beginning with Relling saying, this I know, that the child enters into a marriage problem. That the child enters into a marriage problem. And you must leave the child in peace. And Hjalmar says, oh, Hedvig, my poor Hedvig. Relling says, yes, you must be good enough to keep Hedvig outside of all this. You two are grown-up people. You are free in God's name to make what a mess and muddle you please of your life. But you must deal cautiously with Hedvig. I tell you, else you may do her a great injury. And Hjalmar says, an injury? An injury. And Relling says, yes, or she may do herself an injury, and perhaps others too. Gina says, how can you know that, Relling? Hjalmar says, her sight is in no immediate danger, is it? And Relling says, I'm not talking about her sight. Hedvig is at a critical age. She may be getting all sorts of mischief into her head. Gina says, that's true. I've noticed it already. She's taken to carrying on with the fire out in the kitchen. She calls it playing at house on fire. I'm often scared for fear that she'll really set the house to fire. I had not even considered this and how brilliant it is on Ibsen's behalf to create a story whose central question might be the question of suicide. And that it might be the question of suicide with the main character question involved being the character question of Hedvig. It is her world around which all of this is circling so big. If you take any other character in this play and you plot their world, the goings-on in this play kind of suck, but it's not really all that crazy. For Hedvig, it is. You're talking about the loss of her father, the loss of her dad, her mother being a fallen woman. You're talking about sacrificing her one special thing in the world, a duck. You're talking about the rise and redemption or continued pittance of her grandfather. All of these things are huge in her world. And she is of the age where the question of suicide becomes relevant. How often, how prevalent is that act among people in their early to mid-teens, right? So that is, and there's a lot of stuff going on in that one little area. But I want to jump to page 70. Hedvig says, I have prayed for him as I lay in bed, and since I have always kept it up. Gregor's replies, and now you pray for the duck too. And Hedvig says, I thought it was best to bring in the wild duck, for she was so weakly at first. And Gregor says, do you pray in the morning too? To which Hedvig replies, no, of course not. Gregor's, why not in the morning as well? Hedvig, in the morning it's light, and there's nothing in particular to be afraid of. Gregor's, and your father was going to wring the neck of the wild duck that you love so dearly. Hedvig, no. He said he ought to wring its neck, but that he would spare it for my sake. And that was kind of father. Gregor says, coming a little nearer. But suppose you were to sacrifice the wild duck for your own free will, for his sake. Hedvig rising, the wild duck? Suppose you were to make a free will offering, for his sake, of the dearest treasure you have in the world. And Hedvig replies, do you think it would do any good? To which Gregor replies, try it, Hedvig. And she says, yes, I will try it. That little exchange makes me look at the entirety of Henrik Ibsen's canon so far differently. That is such a ridiculous and hilarious exchange that I cannot read it and not laugh. I cannot read that and pretend it isn't funny. For that reason, I can't do anything but believe that that was written to be funny. If we're allowing Henrik Ibsen to be funny, how much of this thus far have I already misread as dramatic and serious when it should be dramatic and funny? I don't know, but I'm going to be keeping an eye out for that humor through, obviously, the last act of this play, but also the next two plays as well. But that is all I have for this, the fourth of a 6-part series, the penultimate act in the play that has been, and still will be, The Wild Duck by Henrik Ibsen. Hitting the like button really helps me out here on the channel. If you are, for some reason, at this point in the play on the channel, and you have not yet hit that subscribe button, what are you waiting for? And I hope to see you for the final act of this play, as well as the next week, the review of The Wild Duck by Henrik Ibsen.